Welcome to Moonlight Audiobook. I'm Corey, your host, and today I invite you to step quietly into the shadows of a sleepy little English village where not everything is as sweet as it seems. Let me know in the comments wherever in the world you're tuning in from, whether you're wrapped in a blanket with a warm mug of coffee or watching the city lights flicker from your window. So, brew something comforting, a hot chocolate, or whatever your favorite drink, because we're about to unravel a Miss Marple mystery that begins with jam, and ends with justice. This is Miss Marple and the Missing Marmalade Recipe. Let's begin. Chapter 1: The Village Disturbance. It was a cloudless April morning in the village of St. Mildred's. The kind of morning that promised nothing more than polite sunshine, humming bees, and the gentle rustling of bunting strung across the hedgerows. But inside the village hall, the atmosphere was anything but calm. China cups clinked cheerfully. The annual St. Mildred's Marmalade Fair was in full swing, with the air heavy with the scent of oranges, sugar, and secrets. In the far corner, an unassuming woman in a dove-gray coat and a sensible straw hat observed everything through quietly amused eyes. Miss Jane Marple, spinster knitter, and the most dangerous mind ever to grace a garden club. She sipped her tea without fuss. Her gaze lingered not on the contest's golden ribbons, nor on the overworked judge fanning herself with a clipboard, but on the tiny things, the twitch in a housemaid's brow, the subtle hesitation of a competitor opening her picnic basket. These details were, to Miss Marple, far more telling than any headline. The fair was nearing its climax when a stifled shriek cut through the gentle hum of village chatter. Heads turned. A woman had collapsed beside the competition table, trembling lips parted in panic. Her name, Mrs. Geraldine Frobisher, famous throughout 3 counties for her marmalade, and the undeniable favorite to win. Her jars been switched, someone whispered. Miss Marple rose silently from her chair, placing her teacup on its saucer with the precision of someone who knew something had just shifted, something small but dark, like a wasp behind the curtain. Inside the judging tent, the scene was modest chaos. Mrs. Frobisher sat fanning herself with shaking hands as 2 neighbors patted her back. "I locked it. I locked that recipe drawer," she gasped. "And the jar, it's not mine. That's not my marmalade." The jar on the table did, indeed, look like hers. A tidy gingham cloth, secured with twine, her signature white label. But to the keen eye, like Miss Marple's, it was wrong. The gingham pattern was off too uniform, and there were no faint initials in the corner, as Geraldine always stitched. The scent was off too. Miss Marple leaned in just slightly. Cinnamon. Geraldine Frobisher never used cinnamon in her preserves. Outside, the villagers gathered in murmuring knots, unsure whether to gossip or help. Miss Marple joined Mrs. Frobisher on a bench near the rose. "Trellis, my dear," she said gently, "who knew you kept your recipe locked away?" "No one," said Geraldine. "Not even Peter, that's my nephew. I always told him it was just a jumble of scribbles, but I had to keep it safe. Do you?" "No, Fortnum's wrote to me last month about a contract." "Really?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That explains the stakes." Geraldine paled. "You don't think someone stole it to sell?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that someone replaced your jar very carefully, and someone slipped something mild, perhaps valerian, into your tea. Just enough to disorient you, not enough to alarm." Geraldine looked at her, wide-eyed. "How could you know that?" I noticed your hands tremble slightly, but not from nerves, and your tea this morning had a faintly cloudy appearance. Chamomile doesn't cloud. Geraldine blinked. No one else would have noticed. Miss Marple only smiled that evening. When most of the village had retired to gossip behind curtained windows, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Frobisher's cottage. The door creaked open with the scent of lemons and old stone. The kitchen was neat, painfully so. A drawer sat, slightly ajar. Inside, an empty space where the recipe had once been. Miss Marple crouched, studying the handle. A stitch flubby perhaps from gloves, but not leather. This was the faint residue of rose-scented hand cream. She glanced at the floor. A tiny thread caught beneath the drawer gingham again, but a different color than Frobisher's. She turned it over in her gloved hand. How careless. Later that night, seated by the fire in her cozy drawing room, Miss Marple invited Inspector Crayford, man more accustomed to catching drunkards and the occasional fox poacher. He sipped brandy. Jane, surely you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. It's jam, not murder. No one's dead yet, she said with a faint sigh. But Geraldine's recipe is worth quite a sum. And theft often begins sweet and ends quite bitter. Still, he muttered, an awful lot of trouble for some fruit spread. Miss Marple leaned forward. Have you met Mrs. Weatherby, that socialite widow? Always in the paper, yes? She entered the competition today, and she doesn't cook, not even toast. The next morning, Miss Marple walked with Lucy, a bright-eyed maid who split her time between cottages. The girl carried a basket and a guilty look. Mrs. Weatherby asked me to run out early and buy her some marmalade at the market, the day of the fair. She said it was for breakfast, but I noticed she had a new jar in the fridge. Looked homemade, didn't match the others. Miss Marple patted her arm. You're a clever girl, Lucy. You notice things. That afternoon, inside Weatherby's stately kitchen, Miss Marple found the jar. It sat alone, defiant, like a lie left on a silver tray. She opened it gently. Cinnamon at the bottom. A tiny sliver of orange peel with an unusual fold just, like the ones Geraldine always zest, and in the rubbish bin. Burnt parchment. The words boil 3 times, barely legible on the edge. Miss Marple stood still for a long moment. A wind fluttered the curtain. Behind it, someone was watching. She didn't flinch. She closed the jar, straightened her gloves, and smiled too. Herself. Asterisk. There was more to this than a missing recipe. There always was. People think crimes arrive like thunder, loud, shocking, obvious, but Miss Marple knew better. They begin softly. A whisper in a teacup. A jar moved 2 inches. A lie dressed in gingham. Chapter 2. Suspects among teacups. Asterisk. The morning after the fair found St. Mildred's caught in a tangle of whispers and overpoured teacups. From the bakery to the butcher's, every conversation curved eventually toward the same bitter question. Who had stolen Geraldine Frobisher's marmalade recipe? For a crime so domestic, so charmingly English in its setting, it struck a note far too sharp to ignore. There was something in it, something too precise, too rehearsed, to be written off as mischief. And Miss Marple, as ever, was paying attention. She had invited a small group to tea, under the most innocent of pretenses. A morning catch-up. Nothing more, of course. That wasn't the truth, and she suspected they all knew it. The lavender-leaf tea-room was bright and bustling with clinking china and sunlight. But around their table, the atmosphere was a little too careful, like butter left out too long, threatening to melt under the strain. Honoria Weatherby was the first to speak. Dressed in her usual immaculate way, she clasped her teacup with hands that sparkled far more than the silverware. "Such a dreadful business," she said, shaking her head with well-practiced pity. "Poor Geraldine, she must be absolutely crushed." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You were placed in the top 3, weren't you? Quite an achievement for someone who doesn't cook." Honoria gave a small, sharp laugh. "Oh well, I supervised, of course. My maid actually made the marmalade. Old family recipe." "Family recipe," Miss Marple mused, stirring her tea. "Curious. Geraldine's mother once used cinnamon in hers too. Only one copy of that version survived the war, I believe." Something flickered across Honoria's eyes. Not panic, not yet, but a pause, a recalculation. "Perhaps all these recipes are more similar than we realize," she offered, a smile forming a little too late. Miss Marple didn't respond. She simply sipped her tea across the table. Peter Frobisher sat hunched, slightly forward, shoulders drawn, eyes on his saucer. A quiet man, 10 years younger than most of the crowd, and considerably more guarded. He had always seemed uncomfortable in the spotlight that naturally followed his aunt's fame, and now he looked as though the very air was a burden. "She's not been sleeping," he said at last. "My aunt. She just sits up staring out the window." Miss Marple nodded. "Losing a creation, especially one so hard one can feel like losing a part of oneself." "I should have locked the drawer myself," Peter said, voice low. "She asked me to oil the hinges on the back window a few days ago. I might have left it open." Miss Marple murmured. "Was it the kind with a trickle key?" Blinked. "Yes." "Then it wouldn't have stayed open on its own," she said gently. "Not unless someone meant it to." Peter looked up then, eyes narrowing as though seeing a shape in fog. He didn't speak again. Clara Finch arrived late, stern and stiff-lipped, with a dark green coat buttoned too high for the mild weather. She looked more like a prison matron than the vicar's secretary. Clara had been Geraldine's nearest rival for the past 7 years, and her losing streak was the only annual tradition more dependable than the Marmalade Fair itself. "You didn't submit anything this year," Miss Marple noted, after a few moments of polite silence had passed. Clara's mouth tightened. "I was ill, bronchitis, and frankly I'd had enough of the circus. Geraldine always wins. I thought I'd save myself the trouble." "But you still helped at the judging table," Miss Marple said, with a lightness that didn't quite match the question. "I was asked to assist with arrangements." "And the jars did you handle them yourself?" Clara hesitated for just a fraction too long, only to straighten the labels. "Of course," Miss Marple smiled. "You've always had such tidy instincts. I couldn't help noticing your apron yesterday, a gingham pattern, wasn't it? Red and white." "It's common gingham," Clara said coldly. "You can buy a dozen bolts of it at Morton's for £1. Half the women in the village wear it. Yes, that's what makes it so useful for blending in." Clara gave a brittle laugh and looked away, suddenly fascinated by her teaspoon. The last guest was a bit of a puzzle. Eloise Denny was new to the village, a former London food writer who had recently taken up residence in a cottage just beyond the post office. Pretty, clever, and unburdened by children or a husband, she floated easily through social circles with the practiced charm of someone who'd once made a living from flattery. She had accepted Miss Marple's invitation with a smile and a comment. about needing village inspiration. Now, walking with Miss Marple along the green after tea, she bent to pick up a knitting needle that had slipped from the older woman's bag. "You're quite the observer, Miss Marple," she said warmly. "Everyone says you solve things." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Miss Marple replied. "People simply reveal things. It's in their nature. All one must do is sit quietly and listen." "I'm very fond of listening," said Eloise, "especially in villages. So much texture, so many untold things." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Speaking of which, did you ever ask Geraldine for her marmalade recipe?" Eloise laughed. "Once. She was very firm in her refusal. And yet, I noticed your entry at the fair had a particularly rich finish. Unusual clarity, almost identical to Geraldine's." Eloise arched an eyebrow. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Not at all. I've merely learned that imitation can be very flattering and very lucrative." They walked in silence for a moment more, then Eloise smiled. "Would you like to come by for tea tomorrow? I've a new batch of orange and ginger you might enjoy." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her voice remained cool. "I'd love that," she said. "Though, you must tell me where do you find Seville oranges this late in the season?" Eloise's smile faltered, just for a breath, and that, Miss Marple thought, was worth more than any jar on a table. Back in her sitting room that evening, she opened her notebook and underlined a single word: motives. They were ripening, almost ready for harvest, and like the very best marmalade. It was the bitterness that made it linger. Chapter 3. Bitterness behind the sweetness. The wind changed overnight. It was the sort of shift that only the very old or the very observant could feel, like a chord slightly out of tune, humming just below the surface of the village. The bunting from the Marmalade Fair still flapped over the square, but the colors seemed dimmer now, a little bruised. Miss Marple sat by the window in her sitting room, carefully unraveling and re-rolling a skein of blue wool. Outside, the sound of a distant church bell marked the hour, 10:30. Just enough time to think before visitors arrived. She had 4 names in her notebook, for very different people, and though the theft of a recipe may have seemed small in the eyes of lawmen, Jane Marple knew it was never just the thing that was taken. It was what the theft revealed about the person who took it, and all 4 had something worth hiding. The first to return to the scene, as Miss Marple expected, was Peter Frobisher. He arrived with his usual silent guilt, carrying a small basket of apricots that he offered without fanfare. "Aunt Geraldine's not improving," he said quietly. "She's barely eating, keeps muttering about betrayal. She feels violated," Miss Marple replied, pouring 2 cups of tea. "Not because of the loss, you see, but because someone has made her look a fool in the one place she ruled." Peter didn't answer. He simply sipped and stared into the cup. "She mentioned you. Once considered selling the recipe to a company in Birmingham. A private offer." Peter's eyes shot up. "I never would have done it. I only mentioned it in passing." She was furious, said it was a family heirloom, not for profit. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet you're the only one who knew where it was kept." His jaw clenched. "You think I took it. I think you're frightened of what people will think, of what your aunt may believe." He put the cup down with a bit too much force. "She told me I was a disappointment, Miss Marple. She said I didn't deserve the recipe, even if she died tomorrow." He looked at her then. and what she saw in his eyes wasn't rage or greed, but humiliation, deep and old. He left without saying goodbye. By the time the afternoon sun angled across the village square, Miss Marple's second visitor arrived. Invited Clara Finch, clutching a small box of shortbread and a face tight as laced boots. "I know what people are saying," she snapped before she was even offered a chair. "That I'm jealous, that I'd stoop to this." "I've not said a word," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But you think it," Clara hissed, "don't you? You think I'm capable of such pettiness." "Everyone is capable of something, Miss Finch. It depends on the day, the provocation, and the bitterness in the heart." Clara's chin quivered. "She humiliated me, year after year, made me the laughingstock. I put rosewater in my batch last year, and she called it perfume for pigs. That must have stung." Clara stood. "But I didn't steal anything. I wanted to win, not cheat. There's a difference. But it is curious, you visited Geraldine's house the week before the fair." Clara froze. "She told me she needed help mailing out some donation letters. I went to collect them, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, but she was no longer listening to Clara's words. She was watching her hands. Clara had come in furious, ready to defend her pride. And yet, as she clutched the box of biscuits, her thumbs rubbed obsessively over her knuckles. Raw, overwashed, nervous guilt, not indignation. But it wasn't the guilt of a thief. It was the guilt of someone who'd seen something and said nothing. When Clara left, Eloise Dene appeared at the gate. Miss Marple found her waiting beside the garden, dressed in lemon yellow and holding a notebook with dog-eared corners. "I brought the marmalade I mentioned. The ginger orange batch," Eloise said sweetly. "Would love your opinion." Miss Marple gestured toward the kitchen. "I imagine it's quite good," she said. "You've made a career of tasting and borrowing, haven't you?" Eloise's smile faltered. "Borrowing?" Miss Marple poured tea without looking at her. "You published a column last year, didn't you? About forgotten village preserves. You mentioned a marmalade so pure in flavor it shames all others. I don't recall the exact words." "I do," Miss Marple cut in, "because Geraldine had them cut out and pinned above her stove. I believe she suspected." Then Eloise's smile grew tight. "There's no law against inspiration, Miss Marple. Recipes evolve. They're meant to." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but they are also inherited, and stealing one is like forging a will, especially when it's taken from an old woman who trusted her neighbors." Eloise didn't move, but something behind her eyes shifted, cold, calculating. "I suppose this is the point where I storm off in indignation." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear. This is the part where you stay calm and wait to see whether the old lady can prove anything, because you don't think she can." She stood. "But I think you made a mistake." Eloise raised an eyebrow. "And what mistake was that?" "You forgot that Geraldine never used fresh ginger. She hated the aftertaste. Your marmalade isn't hers, it's yours, inspired by hers. You rewrote the recipe based on taste alone, but it isn't identical. And that proves what? That you never saw the actual document, which means someone else gave you the taste, or the jar, or both." The silence turned sharp. Eloise set the jar down gently on the table and left without another word. By evening, Miss Marple stood in her garden under the darkening sky, eyes tracing the ivy along the wall. She was close. The thief had a buyer. The buyer had a deadline. Someone had taken the recipe, but someone else had shared it. One was clever, one was desperate. The bitterness behind the sweetness was beginning to rot, and Miss Marple knew, as sure as the lavender bloomed in spring, that this was no longer just about marmalade. It was about legacy, and before it was over, someone was going to get burned. Chapter 4. A whisper of poison. It began, as most deaths in villages do, with a phone call far too early. The shrill ring startled Miss Marple awake, though she'd been half-conscious already, her mind still turning over the threads of the Marmalade affair like tangled yarn. Outside, the sky was not yet fully light, just the dull gray-pink of an English dawn. She answered, without hesitation. "Jane," came the breathless voice of Inspector Crayford. "We've had an incident. Geraldine Frobisher is dead." There was no gasp, no shock, just a pause, long and still. "How?" Miss Marple asked, though she already knew what he would say. "Collapsed in the kitchen. Her nephew found her. Doctor says it may have been a heart attack, but, well, there was a teacup, and some odd staining around the lips." Miss Marple dressed with quiet deliberation, a soft blouse, her sturdy gray skirt, the shoes with the quietest soles, and her gloves. Always the gloves. The police had cordoned off the kitchen, but the air carried the unmistakable weight of something final inside. Peter sat hunched in the sitting room, his hands clasped together as though in prayer, but there was no peace in his eyes. "I went to wake her," he said softly, as Miss Marple took the seat beside him. "She was up late again. I brought her tea. I thought it might help." "And the tea?" she asked gently. "I left it on the table, then went out to fetch the paper. When I came back, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to." Miss Marple looked at him closely. The sleeve of his shirt was stained with something apricot, perhaps, or blood. It was hard to tell in the weak light, but what struck her more was the exhaustion in his voice, as though something had broken inside him long before. Geraldine's heart had given out. She entered the kitchen alone. It was still warm, faintly sweet from the marmalade simmered the night before. The old cast-iron teapot sat on the stove. Beside it 2 cups, one full, untouched, and one empty, ringed with a faint orange tinge. She leaned in. The scent wasn't quite right. There was citrus, of course, but underneath it, something faintly bitter, a medicinal undertone that didn't belong. Not valerian this time, something harsher. She glanced toward the sink. The sponge was damp. Someone had wiped something away. Sloppy. Miss Marple crouched by the waste bin. Inside, a torn envelope, no address, just the faint impression of an embossed seal, and beside it, a piece of charred paper, half-scorched but legible enough to show the word "preserved." She stood slowly, her fingers tightening around the scrap. This was no accident, and if it had been meant to look like one, it had been a very poor attempt. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. Curtains twitched, footsteps sounded on gravel drives. The news would spread before breakfast. Geraldine Frobisher, Queen of Marmalade, had died less than a week after her recipe was stolen, and the villagers would do what they always did when things turned ugly. They would pretend they hadn't noticed. But Miss Marple had noticed everything. She stopped at the post office on her way home. Inside, the postmistress, a bird-like woman named Sibylla, was arranging mail with the pride of a curator. "Terrible news," Sybil murmured, handing Miss Marple her letters. "I always thought Geraldine would outlive the lot of us. Heart failure, they're saying." "So I heard," said Miss Marple. "I imagine her correspondence has dwindled." "Oh, heavens no. Just the opposite. She received a parcel 2 days ago, special delivery. Had to sign for it. Something foreign, I think." Miss Marple's fingers twitched around the envelope in her hand. "Did you happen to notice who sent it?" Sybil shook her head. "No return address, but the postmark was Geneva, I believe." Geneva. That was no coincidence. Back home, she studied the torn envelope again. The seal, partially melted, was familiar. A merchant's stamp. One she had seen once, many years ago, on a document regarding estate transfers and rare recipes for high-end clients. Geraldine hadn't just guarded her recipe out of pride. She had been preparing to sell it, legally, for a sum large enough to change her quiet life. And someone who knew had decided to change her fate instead. By midday, Inspector Crayford arrived with heavy steps and an expression to match. "The doctor won't confirm poison," he said. "Not yet. But he's suspicious." "There's talk of bitter almond cyanide?" Miss Marple asked softly. Crayford nodded. "Could have been in the marmalade, or the tea." "But if it was marmalade," Miss Marple said, "she would have tasted it instantly." "No, it was the tea," Crayford sighed. "So what now?" "Now," Miss Marple said, standing, "we visit the woman who always seems to be one step behind the truth." That woman was Honoria Weatherby. They found her in her conservatory, surrounded by orchids and the gentle hiss of a watering can. "So tragic," she said, with practiced solemnity. "I was just thinking of visiting dear Peter. Poor boy." Miss Marple looked at her over the rim of her glasses. "Funny, you never struck me as particularly close with Geraldine." Honoria's smile sharpened. "Oh, we were neighbors, after all. It's a community, Jane." "You were also a businesswoman once," Miss Marple replied. "And you lost quite a lot when your husband died. Nearly sold the house, I believe." Honoria's face stiffened. "I survived. Yes, but just barely. And then, a week before the fair, you suddenly acquire a jar of perfect marmalade, cinnamon, old-style boil, a near match to Geraldine's. I told you, my maid, your maid who left your service 3 days ago." Miss Marple leaned forward. "You didn't poison her. You wouldn't risk that. But I believe someone offered you the recipe. In exchange for a future share, you submitted it, hoping no one would notice." Honoria's hands clenched around the watering can. Her nails were freshly painted, immaculate. But one finger, her index, had a faint smear of marmalade beneath the nail. "I don't know what you're implying," she said tightly. Miss Marple stood. "I'm not implying. I'm simply suggesting that sometimes what people steal isn't what they want most. It's what someone else wants." She left without waiting for a reply. Outside, the wind had picked up again. It carried the smell of rain and old flowers, and something else, grief, the kind that doesn't cry or shout, but curls in the corners of rooms and sits in empty teacups. Geraldine Frobisher was gone, but her recipe had survived, and Miss Marple had no doubt that its legacy was still very much alive, twisting its way through village parlors and gloved hands and half-burned paper. There would be another death, she feared, unless she stopped it first. Chapter 5. The Recipe's Shadow. In the quiet hours between dusk and darkness, when the village dogs had gone still, and the chimney smoke curled soft and low, Miss Marple sat with the fire at her feet and the memory of Geraldine Frobisher in her lap. There were two kinds of legacy, she thought, the kind that dies with you, and the kind that kills before you do. Geraldine had been the last living link to a recipe. People remembered only for its taste, but forgot was once born of survival, that marmalade had secrets in it, sharp as citrus peel. And now that she was dead, someone had begun to scrub those secrets clean. But Jane Marple remembered. She remembered a conversation from long ago 1942, a wartime fete when Geraldine had once laughed, glass in hand, and said something no one else seemed to notice. My mother said the Germans had nothing on the local women when it came to hiding things in preserves. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than a joke. But Miss Marple had learned to file away remarks like that Todd-shaped puzzle pieces that didn't belong until they suddenly did. She rose from her chair and pulled out a small wooden box from the cabinet. Inside were a few letters, a pressed pansy, and a crinkled black and white photograph of 5 women standing, arm in arm, beside a long wooden table lined with glass jars. Smiling, tired, proud, Geraldine was the youngest, and beside her, holding a jar of dark orange marmalade, stood Agnes Rutherford, a name no one in St. Mildred's had uttered in decades. Miss Marple tucked the photo into her handbag and stepped into the night. Agnes Rutherford's cottage sat half a mile outside, the village closer to a ruin than a home, yet still clinging to the shape of something once solid. Most believed she had died years ago, but Miss Marple knew better. People like Agnes didn't disappear. They simply withdrew from places they didn't trust anymore. She knocked gently. After a long moment, the door creaked open. Agnes was thin now, hunched by time and burden, but her eyes gray and cold as slate still burned sharp. "Jane Marple," she said without warmth. "It's been years." "I've come about, Geraldine," Miss Marple replied. Agnes didn't flinch. "I know she's dead, poisoned, after her recipe was stolen." Still no reaction, but her fingers gripped the edge of the door. She was about to sell it, Miss Marple continued, to a buyer in Switzerland. "But I think that recipe wasn't hers to sell alone, was it?" Agnes hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in." The cottage was dim, cluttered with old preserves and folded newspapers. But on the far wall, above the hearth, was a frame, not of family, but of a single yellowing document, handwritten, titled Victory Preserve, 1941, by Agnes Rutherford and Geraldine Haythorne, later Frobisher. Miss Marple stared at it. "It was a code," Agnes said at last. "Not just a recipe. During the war, when sugar was rationed and letters were watched, we used ingredients as metaphors. Seville for safe, ginger for gunpowder, cinnamon for cargo. We sent jars to France, marked with notes. Inside the labels, resistance contacts, read them, pass them on." She sat heavily in a wicker chair. "After the war, Geraldine took the recipe, said no one would care about our old codes. But it wasn't about the code. It was about what we did, what we risked." Miss Marple felt the air tighten. "And now," Agnes said, "she's dead, and someone thinks they've erased the past by stealing it." "Who else knew," Miss Marple asked, "about the origin?" "Only one person," Agnes whispered. "Her nephew, Peter. She told him everything after he came back from Lisbon. Said he had a right to know where it all came from. I disagreed. He wasn't part of it." Miss Marple's thoughts turned cold. Peter had claimed to love his aunt, claimed to be devastated, but he had been acting strange, too quiet, too removed. And he had opportunity. He had access. And more than anyone else, he had motive. If Geraldine had planned to sell something that wasn't fully hers, maybe Peter had wanted to stop her. Or maybe he had wanted to sell it himself. The question was, did Peter kill for greed or for principle? Miss Marple thanked Agnes quietly and stepped back into the night, the wind colder now, the village lights dim in the distance. The next morning, Peter was already in the garden when she arrived at Geraldine's. He was watering a row of petunias, though the soil was still wet from last night's rain. She didn't announce herself. She simply waited. Eventually he turned. "I suppose you think I did it," he said. "No," Miss Marple said. "I know you did something worse." His hands froze on the watering can. "You took something sacred, not just from your aunt, from the people who bled to build it. You took a symbol and tried to make it into money." He didn't respond. Miss Marple stepped forward. "You gave Eloise the taste, gave Honoria the formula, played them both, told them there would be buyers, that Geraldine would never know. But when she began to suspect, you panicked. Still, silence. You didn't mean to kill her, but you brewed her tea, and you had a vial, something you took from your time abroad, tasteless, nearly undetectable. You thought just a drop, to make her ill, to frighten her off the deal." He looked at her then, hollow, empty. "She was going to sell it," he whispered. "Without me," she said. "I wasn't worthy. Said I hadn't earned it, but I kept it alive. I'm the one who built the interest." Miss Marple stepped closer. "She didn't die because she sold the recipe. She died because you couldn't bear to be left behind." His voice cracked. "She said I wasn't like them, the women who built it." She was right. He dropped the watering can. It hit the soil with a hollow thud. "I didn't mean to kill her," he said again. Miss Marple nodded sadly. "They never do." Inspector Crayford arrested Peter that afternoon. The poison had been real, and the evidence tiny flecks on the tea strainer, found by Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, was more than enough. He confessed before sunset, but in the end, what disturbed Miss Marple most wasn't the confession. It was the fact that Geraldine Bay, even after all her pride and fire, had known she might be betrayed. The torn note in the bin. The final batch of marmalade, labeled not for judges, but for truth. She had known. And still, she'd said nothing. Sometimes, Miss Marple thought, people don't fight because they believe in forgiveness. Chapter 6. Sometimes a trap. They simply hope to be remembered. There was something about kitchens that Miss Marple found particularly revealing. Bedrooms hid secrets. Studies hid ambitions. But kitchens told the truth. A drawer left half open. A sugar tin missing its lid. A dish towel folded too neatly, as if recently used for something other than drying. And so, it was fitting, she thought, that the final act should begin in one. Peter Frobisher's arrest had sent shockwaves through St. Mildred's, rippling through the village with the potency of poison itself. Most were stunned, but not surprised. A quiet nephew, with a mysterious job abroad and an inheritance at stake. It practically wrote itself. But Miss Marple knew better. Peter had brewed the tea. That much he confessed. But he hadn't acted alone. There was a second hand, one more cautious, more polished. The one who forged the recipe notes. The one who planted the replacement jar at the fair. The one who moved in shadows, behind the curtain of Peter's guilt. And Miss Marple had already invited her to tea. The kettle whistled just as the clock struck 4. The air in Miss Marple's cottage was warm with the scent of lemon scones and Darjeeling. She moved with precision, setting the table for 2, not 2. Formal, just enough effort to keep things disarming. It was an old trick, really. People reveal the most when they believe the moment is ordinary. At exactly 4:12, there was a knock. Eloise Denny stepped in like a magazine spread come to life, perfect curls, tailored coat, a smile that was just warm enough to be suspicious. "Miss Marple," she said brightly, "how lovely. I've been meaning to ask if you've tried my new quince preserve." "Oh, I don't believe I have," Miss Marple replied, "but I must say I'm far more interested in your marmalade." Eloise blinked, just once, but Miss Marple saw it. They sat. The tea was poured. The clinking of cups and spoons created a small orchestra of manners, and then silence. Miss Marple took a slow sip. "Peter confessed," she said. Eloise's smile didn't falter. "So I've heard. He admitted to poisoning the tea." "Yes, such a shame. But he never explained how you got your hands on Geraldine's draft notes." Now the smile flickered, just a hairline crack. But again, Miss Marple saw it. "Not sure what you mean," Eloise said. "Oh, come now," Miss Marple said kindly. "We both know you didn't reverse engineer that recipe. It was too perfect. And Geraldine, bless her soul, was many things, but careless she was not. The copy was never in Peter's hands. He admitted it. He tasted the marmalade and described it to you, but the draft, that was never his to give." Eloise's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "You're mistaken," she said. "Peter told me everything, yes, but you had the handwriting. You forged the label. That sort of confidence doesn't come from hearsay." Miss Marple leaned back, her voice growing almost playful. "Which leads me to the night before the competition, when someone was seen leaving Geraldine's kitchen door, wearing gloves, a figure too tall to be Peter, and your Madagoth was seen on the 7:15 train to Oxford that morning, carrying a bag of preserves she claimed were for delivery. Curious, don't you think?" Eloise said nothing. The trap was working. "Agatha's sister lives in Oxford," Miss Marple continued. "She works at a rare foods supplier, coincidentally the same one contacted by the buyer in Geneva. Peter didn't orchestrate that. He wasn't clever enough. You were." Eloise's jaw tightened. Miss Marple pressed her advantage. "You needed Peter, his connection to Geraldine, his trust. But when things grew messy, when Geraldine grew suspicious, you fed his insecurity. You knew he might do something reckless. You let him." Now Eloise stood slowly. "You have no proof." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Proof, perhaps not yet, but I do have something else." She rose, walked to the counter, and returned with a sealed glass jar, her own. Inside was a single orange preserve, flecked with cinnamon. "I made this yesterday," she said, "using your version of the recipe." Eloise stared. "I thought you might enjoy a taste," Miss Marple continued. "It's missing something, of course. Geraldine never wrote down one of the ingredients. She only ever added it by instinct." She opened the jar. The scent rose, citrus, sugar, but also something metallic, faint but unmistakable. Eloise stepped back. "You see," Miss Marple said, "when you reprinted that recipe for Fortnum's, you didn't realize that Geraldine's marmalade always included a trace of rosemary. She used to say it was to remind people not to get too comfortable with sweetness." The room fell quiet, and then Eloise laughed. It wasn't a charming laugh. It was something brittle and dangerous. "You're clever," she said. "I'll give you that. You took advantage of a lonely man's pride," Miss Marple said quietly. "You used his grief, and when he faltered, you stepped aside and let him fall." Eloise tilted her head. "And what now? Will you have me arrested for conspiracy? For bad manners?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "But I think you'll find things more difficult from here." She opened a side drawer, revealing a small envelope, Geraldine's last letter, never sent, recovered from the bottom of her writing desk. It was addressed to Agnes Rutherford. It said, quite simply, "If anything happens to me, watch Eloise Denny. She's cleverer than she looks." "Now," Miss Marple said, setting the letter on the table, "shall I ring the inspector, or would you prefer to confess quietly?" Eloise stared at the letter for a long moment, and then she reached for her handbag, not to flee, to pull out a folded sheet of paper, the original draft of the stolen recipe. She placed it on the table without a word. Miss Marple nodded. "It's over now, my dear." Outside, the sky had turned amber with the setting sun. The village would sleep peacefully tonight, unaware that justice had been served in the most English way possible, with marmalade, tea, and just the right touch of quiet vengeance. Chapter 7. The Reveal over Toast. The morning after the storm is always the quietest. In St. Mildred's, the birds still sang, the grocer still unpacked his fruit crates, and the milk bottles clinked neatly against doorstep bricks. It was, to any outsider, an ordinary spring morning, but to those seated around Miss Marple's modest kitchen table, it was anything but. Inspector Crayford sat near the window, notebook closed, hands folded as if in church. Clara Finch twisted her handkerchief in her lap. Honoria Weatherby tapped one finger slowly on the wood grain. Peter Frobisher looked as though he hadn't slept in days. Eloise Denny was the only one who still wore lipstick, and at the head of the table sat Miss Marple, pouring tea with deliberate gentleness. There was no need to raise her voice. The silence did most of the work. "Well," she began, "it's only fitting, I think, that something so bitter should be resolved with something sweet." She reached for a jar of marmalade, Geraldine's last true batch, thick, golden, a tiny piece of rosemary suspended in amber like a fossil. She spread it delicately across a slice of toast and took one bite before continuing. "I have often found," she said, "that crimes in villages are not about money, but about memory, about what people believe they're owed, and what they cannot bear to lose." Her gaze drifted to Peter. "Peter brewed the tea," he confessed, "but the poison, well, it was meant to be something mild, just enough to frighten his aunt into backing away from the sale." Peter looked up, hollow. "I didn't know she was that weak," he said quietly. "She seemed so strong all the time, so sharp." "She was," Miss Marple said gently. "But hearts, like legacies, grow brittle when handled too roughly." She turned slightly in her chair. But Peter wasn't working alone. And this is where things get interesting. Someone else fed the fire. Someone who encouraged his resentment, who offered a way out of Geraldine's control, who planted the idea that the recipe could be sold under a different name, who even provided a buyer, a ghost contact. Eloise folded her arms. "You have no proof," I encouraged him. "No." Miss Marple smiled. "Then let me explain. What I do have." She set her teacup down with care. "First, I have the notes Geraldine wrote the ones you claimed Peter gave you, but the original, burned copy was recovered from your fireplace. A careless detail one your maid confessed to noticing before she quit, said it smelled like cinnamon and glue. Eloise's mouth twitched just slightly. Second, Miss Marple continued, I know you contacted Agnes Rutherford's sister under a false name, said you were researching an article, asked whether any old wartime preserve recipes had ever been submitted for private documentation. That line alone would have meant nothing except that only 3 women knew about the wartime codes. In those jars, Geraldine, Agnes, and me. She paused, taking another bite of toast. Which brings us to the marmalade you entered at the fair, Eloise. The taste was close but not quite. You mimicked texture, balance, even the signature cinnamon twist, but the rosemary, you missed it. Most wouldn't have noticed, Eloise said coldly. But Geraldine would have, said Miss Marple. She did. That's why she scheduled a meeting with her solicitor the following Monday. She was going to revoke the deal, and that's why you stopped her. Eloise's hands were steady, her eyes sharp, but she said nothing. I believe, Miss Marple said, you suggested Peter deliver the tea that morning. You even gave him the mild sedative, something from your own cabinet. A tincture from overseas. Peter's eyes widened. You told me it was herbal. Eloise's voice was soft. But it wasn't. It had interacted with Geraldine's existing medication effect. Eloise either didn't know or didn't care about the result. A cardiac arrest mistaken for a simple heart failure. No suspicion. No autopsy. Not until Miss Marple insisted. Inspector Crayford cleared his throat. Lab confirmed trace amounts of sodium oxybate, easy to mask in citrus. Eloise glanced toward the window. Not in panic, just calculation. Every move she'd made had been tidy, smart, untraceable, except for one mistake. The rosemary, Miss Marple said again. You tried so hard to recreate Geraldine's legacy, and yet you overlooked the one thing she never wrote down, the one part of herself she kept secret. That's the difference between a thief and a creator. At last, Eloise's shoulders sank. Not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the weight. I didn't want her dead, she said. I believe. You, Miss Marple said, but you did want her erased. Crayford stood slowly, cuffs in hand. Eloise didn't resist. She adjusted her sleeves, as though preparing for an interview. As she passed Miss Marple, she paused. You could have sold it. You know, you're clever enough to write recipes yourself. Miss Marple smiled. I prefer toast. The room emptied. Gradually, Peter left in silence. Clara excused herself with a whispered apology. Honoria, who had remained mostly mutifored, a shallow nod, and the faintest tear. Only Miss Marple remained at the table, her plate now empty, save for a few crumbs, and a streak of marmalade. She looked at the jar once more. It wasn't the recipe that had mattered. Not really. It was what it represented. Courage, survival, legacy, and the fine, fragile thread that connects one generation of women to the next through flavor and fire and quiet resistance. Outside, the postman walked past, humming. Miss Marple stood, rinsed her plate, and placed the jar on the highest shelf. Some legacies, she thought, are best preserved the old-fashioned way. Chapter 8. Justice Preserved. A week had passed since Eloise Denny was taken from the village in the back seat of a dark car with no ceremony and no goodbyes. St. Mildred's, as it always did, returned to its rhythm. bunting came down. Teacups resumed their gentle chatter. The church bell tolled, this time for peace, not tragedy. But something had changed. Not in the streets, nor in the shops, but in the air itself. A subtle shift, like the first breath after a long, sharp storm. People walked a little softer, looked each other in the eye just a moment longer, as if reminded that danger doesn't always arrive with thunder. It can come dressed in smiles and marmalade jars. Miss Marple had received a letter that morning, hand-delivered. The paper was fine. The seal was red wax, unbroken, and the handwriting, though delicate, was unmistakably old. She unfolded it by the fireplace. "Jane, I knew you'd put the pieces together. That was always your gift, not just hearing, but listening. If I hadn't trusted you, I wouldn't have dared to write this. The truth is, I never wanted to sell the recipe. Not really. I just wanted to see who'd try to take it from me. I was tired of watching people rewrite my history while I was still breathing. I wanted to be remembered on my own terms. You've given me that. With love, Geraldinette was dated 2 days before her death." Miss Marple folded the letter and tucked it gently into the back of her recipe book. Later that afternoon, she walked to the edge of the village where Agnes Rutherford's house stood. Ivy-wrapped and stubborn as ever, Agnes answered the door without a word. Inside, the fire was already lit. 2 teacups steamed on the table, and between them an old, battered tin box sat waiting. "She left this for you," Agnes said. "Said you'd know what to do with it." Miss Marple opened the box. Inside were 4 identical recipe cards, each labeled in Geraldine's hand. "Victory Preserve, the true recipe, with the rosemary," with the weight of history behind each line. She felt her throat tighten. Agnes didn't speak for a while. When she finally did, her voice was quiet and hollow. "We did things back then. Sent messages, hid maps under labels, risked our lives. And when the war ended, we just went back to pickling pears. Nobody ever asked what it cost." "I know," Miss Marple said. "She fought to keep it alive," Agnes whispered. "Not the taste, the meaning. And they tried to turn it into marketing copy." Miss Marple looked down at the recipe cards. "I won't let that happen," she said. The next day, without announcement, a letter was delivered to the editor of Country Life. It included a copy of the recipe, an explanation of its wartime origins, and a simple request that it be published freely, without attribution or commercial claim. It ran the following month. In a feature titled "Preserving the Past, the Women Who Coded Resistance into Citrus." Miss Marple didn't sign her name. She didn't need to. On the day of Geraldine Frobisher's memorial, the village turned up in full. The church pews overflowed. A small table near the altar held her last blue-ribboned jar of marmalade, still, sealed, gleaming softly in the morning light. Peter stood in the back. He was pale, gaunt, but not broken. He had been cleared of murder, his actions deemed negligent, not deliberate. He would not face prison. But his guilt was a heavier sentence. As the organ played a quiet hymn, he approached Miss Marple on the steps outside. "I never wanted it to end like this," he said. "I know," she replied. "But wanting isn't the same as doing." He nodded. "What will happen to the recipe?" Miss Marple looked past him, toward the fields where spring had finally taken hold. "It will be remembered," she said, "the right way." In the weeks that followed, something strange began to happen in St. Mildred's. Old women began digging out their recipe boxes. Forgotten notebooks reappeared. Handwritten cards were passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor, folded into aprons and tucked into jam jars. Not just marmalade, but onion chutney, plum conserve, rhubarb wine. Stories came with them. Stories about food shared in shelters, of deliveries made under blackout curtains, of birthdays celebrated with sugar rations and rosehip syrup. And through it all, Miss Marple watched, not as a detective, but as a witness, a quiet observer of legacy not stolen, but restored. One evening, she stood in her own kitchen, the sky outside streaked with rose and gold. The kettle was boiling. She opened her cupboard and reached for a jar. Own version of Victory Preserve. It wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was honest, and it was hers. As she poured the tea and spread the marmalade across the toast, she paused. There was a silence in the room, but not the absence of sound, the presence of memory. And so, dear listener, the last crumb of toast has been eaten, the final clue revealed, and justice quiet and precise has been served. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with Miss Marple under the glow of moonlight, don't forget to tap that like button, share the story with a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe to Moonlight Audiobook for more tales that whisper in the dark. You never know what secrets tomorrow's story might hold. But one thing's certain, I'll be here, waiting by the fire, with the next twist ready. Until then, keep the kettle warm, and your wits even warmer. Good night.